Okay, in today's video, the driving question is, what are the steps of the experimental design process? So the first step is a statement of the problem. Then we're going to write a hypothesis, list the variables, write a procedure, make some observations including a data table, analyze that with a graph, discuss sources of error, a conclusion, and applications and recommendations. So let's kind of go through each of these. Before I start this, understand that each teacher has different expectations for their experimental design. So first and foremost, be sure to check with your teacher's rubric for the experimental design that they expect from you. I'm going to give you a general experimental design that is typical for most experiments, but keep in mind that it could vary and you need to follow your teacher's rubric. So let's go through this. Statement of problem. Now I'm not going to take the time to go through and read and go into detail about all of these. I thought I would just hit some of the highlights. So this is not a simple yes/no, but a typical format would be, how does the independent variable, whatever that is, affect the dependent variable, question mark. So that would be a good way to write a statement of problem. Hypothesis. Again, just going to hit some of the highlights here. It's going to discuss a relationship or a trend. And you probably remember in middle school or your early science courses the if-then statement. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit more sophisticated and we're going to include because, which for us is going to be the rationale. And the rationale is based on research. So you're providing an if-then relationship, which means simply that you're expressing the relationship between the independent variable, okay, that's the if, and how that will affect the dependent variable, that's the then. And then your because is going to be your rationale. So you're providing a reasoning for this. All right, variables. There's independent, dependent variables. There's also your controlled variables. So the independent variable is the manipulated variable. You should only have one independent variable and make sure you include units. And it must be defined. Describe how the variable is measured and used or defined within the study. And you must have at least 3 values, or also known as 3 levels of your independent variable. And I'm going to give you an example of that near the end of the video. Dependent variable, this is the effect in the cause and effect relationship. It depends on the independent variable. We're also going to define the dependent variable as well. All right, the controlled variables, these are going to remain constant. That's the key here. Controlled variables are also known as constants. So I want you to have at least 4 constants. These are things that are not going to change because there's only one thing that you're changing, and that's the independent variable. And you only have one independent variable. Everything else remains constant. Next is your control or standard of comparison. This is also known as the control group. And this is what we're going to compare the independent variable to actually ensure that there was a change. You need to provide a rationale for why you chose that. And it must be, or probably it's going to be, as close to normal as possible. Meaning a normal situation where there are no manipulated changes in that normal environment. And I will give you an example of that again in a few minutes. Okay, we're going to write a procedure, but before you do that, you must list all the materials and tools that you're going to use and the quantity for each. In your procedure, just make sure it's organized, it's logical, and kind of think of it as if someone else was going to run it, they could run it based on your procedure alone. Make sure you have multiple trials. It's going to be very important that you have several trials. Make sure to include safety procedures in your actual experimental procedure as well. All right, observations. This is where we're going to actually collect some data. So there's two types. There's quantitative, which is numerical, and qualitative. So quantitative is going to be raw data in a data table, including units. It must be have a title at the top and a caption at the bottom. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then if you have sample calculations that you're using with this raw data, make sure to include those. Now again, it's sample. That means if you're running the same equation over and over and over, just give it one example of that equation. And then this is very important. Report all data using correct significant figures. Remember the rules for correct significant figures. Since you're using lab equipment and measuring devices, some measuring devices are more precise than others. So the precision of the device is going to determine the sig figs. So the least precise device will be the number of significant figures that you're going to use in your data. So you cannot have any more significant figures than the least number of significant figures in the data collected based on that least precise device. All right, the next one is qualitative observations, which are non-numerical. So list any problems maybe that you've seen. Talk about the results as you're collecting the data. Any kind of observations, even outside factors, things that you've noticed that's not numerical, but might be relevant to understanding and analyzing the data. And now we're in analysis. So typically we're going to do this with graphs, and all graphs typically, depending on your teacher, but for physics and engineering class, it's going to be with Excel. And you must have an appropriate type of graph. We're usually going to do line graphs, but it depends on the experiment. Maybe a bar graph or some other type of graph might be more appropriate. So just consider the type of graph based on the data that you've collected. Make sure it's appropriately scaled. You need a title on top. Keep track of your units, and you need a caption. Again, I'll show you a caption in a couple minutes. Then you're going to interpret your data. So this is where you're going to draw some reasonable conclusions about your experiment. Discuss any unusual data points or outliers. You're going to hopefully see some trends. So be sure to point them out. And then it's time to do some statistics. Typically, teachers are going to expect that you provide things like the mean, the median, the mode, the range, and or a line of best fit that describes the slope and the y-intercept. Those would all be appropriate. Your teacher might expect you to also provide standard deviation. You will not have to do that in your phys-eng class, but standard deviation might be something you want to do research on to enhance your analysis of the data. It basically talks about the variation in your data points, and it usually is more relevant when you have multiple data points, many data points. So a high deviation indicates that the data points are spread out over a large range of values, and on the other hand, low deviation indicates that the data points tend to be very close to the mean. So that's something you might want to look at as well, but it's not required. All right, sources of error are very important. Students typically will skip right over this, but this is really important. So don't try to hide any error. This is a time to actually talk about what could be wrong with your experimental setup. Provide some important information about the data collection. Give some possible reasons for the errors, and very importantly, discuss how it affected the data. Now remember, this is in terms of data collection. Okay? Sources of error of your experiment. This is about experimental errors, not errors in your analysis. For example, you wouldn't say that one of your errors is in the way that you graph the data, because the error of graphing the data is just your inability to make a good graph. It has nothing to do with the way the data was collected. You wouldn't say miscalculations because that just shows that you made a mistake in your calculations. It's not a mistake in the way the data was collected. So focus on data collection. Do not just say human error, but be very specific when you're talking about sources of error. All right, getting near the end here, at the conclusion, you want to restate your hypothesis. And you must evaluate your hypothesis based on the data, which will then allow us to either accept or reject the hypothesis with reasons which are based on that data. So remember, you're not just going to slide past this and kind of ignore whether or not your hypothesis was right or wrong. You're going to say it right here. You're going to say whether it was accepted or rejected and tell clearly why it was. All right? What are some ways that you could improve the experiment? Or maybe you would do something completely different to get a different trend in your experiment. What are some things that you could do to improve it or to fix the experiment if you think something was wrong? And then finally, at the very end, is the application and recommendations for further use. This is going to be some suggestions for taking the experiment further. Not necessarily repeating it, but going a little bit further with it. How could it be applied in the real world? Maybe there's another experiment that you did research on that was similar, and the results of your experiment would help provide more information about solving a certain problem. So how could it be related? Just you're trying to apply it in the real world. So here we have a group of students that do an experiment on radish plants. So pause the video here, read the scenario carefully, and write a statement of problem and write a hypothesis. Okay, now I'm going to show you the statement of problem that I came up with. What is the effect of sunlight on the height of plants? And the hypothesis is, research shows that plants contain chlorophyll, a green pigment that absorbs sunlight during photosynthesis. This would be something that you got from your research. This is a rationale for the statement I'm about to make. Therefore, if the sunlight is increased, then the height of the plants will increase. So I made a statement and I'm providing a rationale. The rationale can come before or after that statement. It doesn't really matter. Okay, same scenario. Pause the video and list the independent and dependent variables, the control variables or constants, and the control group. Describe and provide rationale for your standard of comparison. Pause the video here. Okay, so the independent variable I came up with was the amount of light measured in hours. Plants will be given 0 hours, 12 hours, and 24 hours of light. Do you remember earlier where I said you had to define it? So notice I said the amount of light measured in hours. I'm clearly defining that independent variable, and I'm also providing 1, 2, 3 levels to my independent variable. This is an example of 3 levels. In your experiments, you need to have a minimum of 3 levels. So in this case, the levels were the amount of light that was given. The dependent variable is the height of the plants will be measured in centimeters. I'm defining what that is. The height of the plants will be measured in centimeters. Control variables. These are just some examples. There could be many. 4-inch pots, 100 grams of potting soil, 25 milliliters of water daily, and you would list several. In fact, I would want you to give me at least 4. I've only listed 3 here. And the control, the level of the above scenario that most acts like normal, quote unquote, kind of think of that as a normal situation, would be 12 hours of sun and 12 hours of dark, because that's how the Earth in most areas typically has about 50-50 in terms of hours or time of light and dark. Now, of course, we know in the seasons that's not always true. It depends if you're close to the poles or close to the equator. But you can think of that as being as close to normal as possible. And so you're comparing the 24-hour darkness and the 24 hours of sunlight to a more normal situation of daylight and dark. Okay, pause the video here and list the materials that you think you would need. All right, so the materials I came up with, you can see these, list these out here. You want to list not just which materials and tools that you'll need, but how many of each. I'm not going to write a procedure, but I thought I would provide a checklist. This checklist may or may not be complete. Make sure to check with your teacher's rubric, but this is just a checklist to give you an idea of, are you going through all the things that are expected in a good procedure? Remember, you can also come up with a flow chart that's used as a procedure as well. But you need to provide a description between the sections of the flow chart. In fact, here's an example of a flow chart. This is a good one. But sometimes you need to provide statements between each of the bubbles or each of the cells to provide further information as to how they're associated or how they're connected. So pay attention to that if you're making a flow chart. Now for some quantitative observations. Let's look at graphs. Yeah, I'm going to go right to this graph. So I would want you, here's an example. This is one style of graphs. And notice it has a title. It has units. And as I mentioned on the previous page here, or you may have read, there's some general rules or guidelines, and you can read through this on your own, okay? But I have the independent variable on the left, and then I have the dependent variable to the right of that, and then any additional information would be to the right of the dependent variable. I also would want you to add a caption. So let me give you an example of a caption. Okay? All right, caption. Just like in a textbook, we'll call this figure 1. I don't need to put a colon there. Let me just put figure 1. And then I'm going to write the title, the effect of sunlight on height of plants. And of course you would type this. Then you want to provide a short description of the figure. So on here I'll just put this figure, not figure, I'll say this table shows no, let's not say that. This table shows the growth of plants at various amounts of light exposure. Just some kind of little description. All right, here's another one. Here's a different type of table. Looks a little bit different. And again, you would want to provide a caption. We'll call it figure 2. Give the title, and then give a short description of table. Okay? So in this one, I might write something like, this table shows a correlation in plant height and sunlight exposure. I'm not going to write that here. All right? What are some examples? Pause the video here and list some qualitative observations that might be appropriate based on that scenario. Pause the video. Okay, so here's some things I came up with. The color of the leaves, the shape of the leaves, the overall shape of the plant, problems that were observed with insects destroying the plant, maybe eating the leaves, things like versus Vera. I'm not going to go into that here, but you might want to talk about things such as temperature fluctuations among different rooms, and precision of height measurements, and precision of the time measurements. Just go into detail and be specific as to each of these errors and how they affected the data. Also discuss how these errors could be minimized in the future. All right, conclusion. What is the purpose of the experiment? What were the major findings? Was the hypothesis supported by the data? How did your findings compare with those of other researchers? What happened that you did not expect, or can you explain it? What recommendations do you have for improving this experiment? And here you can see some examples of how each of those could be written based on that previous scenario. So you can pause the video here and read those. And then finally, applications. How could you go further? You can read this example of how this person was providing an example of a practical application of how this information could be connected to another one. Okay, so here's another scenario. If you'd like to go through this on your own, this is just volunteer. If you want some extra information, you can read through this scenario and you can answer all of these sections, basically do an entire experimental design based on this scenario if you would like. But here is what you're going to be doing tomorrow in PhysEng. All right, you're going to be required when you come into class to have watched this video, and then you're going to have a task. Your goal is to design and conduct an experiment using at least 2 of the materials provided. You're going to be given about 50 to 60 minutes to conduct, write up, and then clean up your station. You're going to be given 1 piece of cardboard, a ping pong ball, a golf ball, 1 solid plastic ball, a rubber pad, 1 meter stick, and a table. I'll also provide some masking tape at my desk. So some other materials you could bring in if you wanted to would be something to time, a timepiece, a calculator, a ruler, something to write with, and goggles if you want. Now, you must include all of these, basically everything we just covered, okay, and then clean up. So you have 50 to 60 minutes to conduct an experiment using at least 2, if not all of these materials, in an experiment that has data, right? You got to have data that you can actually graph. So you got to cover all of this information with an experiment that you're going to conduct. So you can go ahead and start thinking about it now so that when you come into class and work in your group, you'll already have some ideas and you get the ball rolling. Huh, get it? Okay, so good luck with that, and just rewind this video or go back and watch any of the areas that you need to see again. I would recommend that you take some notes on some of those key areas as well.